So hello everyone. I'm very happy to introduce today Laura Mojica, who's going to give a talk about enaction, the status of tools and the concrete life of artifacts. So thank you very much for being here. Thank you, Laura.
Thank you, Leo. Okay, the presentation. Okay, so I think it's on. I think okay. So today I'm going to talk about what I've been working since I came in March here to the Basque Country as a Juan de la Cierva Fellow. And I'm going to talk enaction, the status of tools, and the concrete life of artifacts. So basic intuition that started this work is that human forms of life depend on tools and artifacts. We know that, right? Action network. Material engagement theory, too, has argued that material structures are agents, like they characterize this dependency in terms of agency. And they consider those constraints, they open possibilities, and they actively respond in ways intentions could not foresee and that counteract what the individual wants to do. That's why they do attribute agency to material artifacts and to matter in general. But the problem with this is that the notion of agency that they use is too loose, and they take some necessary features sufficient for agency. So the notion of agency that they have is a bit too loose, and that's a problem, attributing agency to everything. So enaction offers an operational definition of agency that doesn't have these problems of being a bit too loose and like attributing agency to whatever imposed constraints and whatever doesn't behave as we want to behave. And this definition allows us to differentiate systems that are agents from the rest, which is nice. But the problem, well, what I see, is that enaction has focus in the time scale of the completion of an action, like when the agent is interacting with a tool, and has overlooked the social material context in which sensorimotor agency emerges and occurs. As I was saying, an action has focused on the completion of a task on the time scale of an action, when you complete an action, and the interaction that occurs between an agent and the tool in the completion of action, but it doesn't give you like the social material context in which tools happen and human sensorimotor agency happens. So what I want to do in this talk, in this paper, is to address the dependency between human agency, sensorimotor agency in particular, and tools and artifacts in a time scale that is longer than the completion of an action. Doing that allows us to approach the constraining nature of nature, the active nature of nature, without attributing them full agency, and without assuming its role to just being incorporated or being used by an agent in a concrete point of time, completion of an action. Okay, so let me start by talking very briefly about enactive sensorimotor agency and what the toolness of tools can tell us in this analysis. So the idea, again, this is very briefly, very quick, because it's not the point of the talk, because already Xavi and colleagues have done this. Basic agency are systems that are sources of asymmetrical changes, and these asymmetrical changes are normatively guided to maintain the system. This is basic agency. Matter, although can impose asymmetrical interactions, for example, if a potter is molding clay and the clay suddenly breaks, then this imposes asymmetrical break and a break in the interaction. This is asymmetrical, it's not what the agent wanted to do, but this is not a normatively guided interaction, it's not a normatively guided change. And that is a huge difference between matter and between agency in general. So, the difference is that one is regulated, normatively regulated, what agents do, and what materiality does is not a regulated activity. While sensorimotor agency, not this notion of basic agency, is constituted by networks of sensorimotor schemes that allow the agent to do things in the world, to be guided by perception and to move around in the world. And these networks are precarious and they need to be maintained. And they need to be maintained to carry out activities, and they are by carrying out the activities themselves. And the material environment in which this sensorimotor agency occurs is everything that the agent engages with. That's pretty much what it is. So what happens when the action is complete, when the sensorimotor agent stops, I don't know, like eating with a spoon or hammering with a hammer? So on the one hand, we have a sensorimotor agency that may remain the same. It may have become a skillful, or it may have exercised a skill that he or she already had. They may have incorporated the environmental aspect, the tool. They may have become skillful or incorporated. This is a matter of another paper, what happens with the agent when the action is completed. But what I want to know here is what happens with the tool, with the object that was part of this coupling with the agent. And in the immense majority of cases, of course, for human forms of life, the environmental structures that we interact with and that we couple with are already functional tools, and they're part of socially shared contexts of use. And the toolness, meaning the status of them as tools, doesn't seem to vanish once we stop using them. So the tool, after the action is completed, I would like to say that depends on it being used in a context of use, a wider context of use. There is already one concept that captured this idea from the 50s, I think, from, well, the 60s, 70s, from Roger Baker, and then taken by Heft in ecological psychology, and it's a behavior setting. And a behavior setting is a well-delimited space, like this room, in which there is a material arrangement of things that allow a social practice to occur, like what's happening right now, that we have this setting of chairs, so this particular arrangement in which I can talk to you, and you can see me, and you can pay attention to me, and we're reproducing the practice of giving academic talks. This can also happen with spoons, spoons in kitchens and in dining rooms, where you have an arrangement of pottery and tables, etc., where spoons are used and are used in a common way, in a shared way by people. These contexts of, well, these behavior settings also impose a normativity, and by the way, that's something that a colleague and I argued this year, if you want to check. But a behavior setting is not the only space in which tools are used, and it's not the only context of use where tools are used. They're more generally part of collective patterns of organized materiality, where there are many behavior settings happening, and there are many people using tools at the same time, not only in one behavior setting. So this happens like in a wider scale, not only in a specific place and time, but many places at many times. So the toolness of this object seem to depend on their belonging to this context of use, that they are part of a behavior setting, that they are part of shared practices in which they are used. When the context of use disappear, the toolness, the functionality of the object also disappear. There is, well, I think most of you will recognize this. This happened with floppy disks. So floppy disks used to be useful at some point, and the usefulness depended on computers that could read this, that they exist. It depended on practices. I remember me when I was in high school and in primary school, well, that they were teaching me how to use this, how to store documents and share them with other people. And it depended on a big network of companies producing floppy disks, companies producing computers that were able to read floppy disks, and people in governmental institutions asking for floppy disks, etc. And there was like a network of behavior settings, social practices, that rendered them useful. Now this is not the case anymore. Most of you, the youngest one, maybe will have never used them, because we don't have computers to read them. Nobody produces them since 2008, I think. And they're just practically useless because the context of use disappeared. So what I want to do in the rest of the talk is to show that there are at least 3 processes that make context of use, that make of an object a tool. And these processes are the following. One is the skill reproduction in social practices, that we reproduce the skill to use certain tools. The other one is the constitution of the tool, of the very object as a tool with a function. And the third one is the maintenance process of these tools and of the behavior settings and the context of use that render them useful. So let's start with the first one, with skill reproduction and social practices. So sensorimotor agents become agents. Part of the process of them becoming agents is that they're trained to manage skillfully something, like an aspect of the environment. And the individual goes there through assimilation and accommodation processes to master the tool. This training, these processes of training, are virtually always a social process. We are always accompanied by other people, whether it be parents or peers, and it happens not only for children being trained to behave as persons in society, like normal persons, but also with specialized training to use specialized tools. And these are always social processes. And part of the socialization process, part of it being social, implies that we are becoming part of a certain form of life when we are being trained to use tools in a certain way. So what is key here is that the training process is something that allows us to become part of a shared form of life. So let's start understanding the idea of a form of life. So the idea of form of life, at least in the analytical tradition and then later in sociology, comes from Wittgenstein, famously. And there is a branch of sociology called social practice theory, in which social practices are the unit of explanation for how social life happens. The most famous of all these people that work on practice theory is Bourdieu, but I'm not using Bourdieu, but okay. Anyway, so the idea that all of them share is that human life, a form of life, is constituted by bundles of social practices. And a social practice is social practices are organized human actions, and they're organized in some way. These human actions, importantly, are not only what we do with our bodies, but also how we speak. So they're both linguistic and non-linguistic. And there are different ways of conceptualizing how this organization occurs. According to Chatsky, which is who I'm following, this organization, that the actions, the doings that we do, are organized through practical understandings. Bourdieu, yesterday I learned that in his later writings, defended that the organization is through the maximization of individual capital, which is a different idea than through understandings. But he liked understandings for the reasons that you will see here. So these understandings are practical, and every individual is educated to make themselves what they do, how they present themselves, the bodily movements, and the way that they coordinate with features of the environment and with others. They're trained to make them understandable to others. That's the key point of socialization and the key point of a form of life. Understanding here is embodied, is grounded in a repertoire of bodily doings, of performances, and they cannot be exhaustively formulated in words or in rules. You can, of course, say rules, like rules of thumb, like rules that try to capture how you behave in the table, let's say, when at dinner with your parents-in-law, for example. But they're not exhaustively formulated, but this is the set of rules, but it's rather a bodily doing, a bodily repertoire of abilities that we have. And that's the kind of understanding that we're looking for. Understanding is also determined by interaction and recognition. To say does or this person is saying what they're doing, or to name the thing if they're asked to say what is this person doing. And its root in familiarity is not the action or the movements as an with the relevant things that the person does, with the material features that the people typically involve, with the settings in which this occurs, and the useful progression of the interaction between agents. So to be part, okay. So remember that human actions and a form of life is human actions organized by these kind of understandings, grounded on familiarity, but knowing how to do things and to interact with others and the environment. So to be part of a form of life will be to be and to act in ways that others can recognize and can interact with, and to act in ways that are familiar to others, and it involves an immediate intelligibility of the other as somebody that makes sense, and being yourself able to recognize when others make sense. So if this is the case, and if human life is organized through understanding each other, part of the education and training is not only to achieve certain results, certain practical outcomes, but we also train other people, other bodies, to be and to act in ways that are intelligible and understandable to others. This, of course, applies to training tools and artifacts, that is the goal, the interest of this stuff. And this includes training people to use them in the appropriate settings in an intelligible way. So there is a very clear example that the training or the constitution of the sensorimotor agency in humans is not only about a practical outcome, but also about being understandable, in an example that Ilienkov gave, and then Di Paolo and Potakov discussed. And the example is of children being taught to use spoons, but these children are deaf and they're blind. So they're used to eat porridge, this is in the example, like putting their face in the porridge, like just thrusting it and eating like that. So when they're trained to use a spoon, they put the spoon in their hands, but the spoon, and here is the quote, the spoon is a very inconvenient object. It is superfluous to the old mode, namely to put your face in the porridge, which is very, very efficient if one thinks of it. It's superfluous, it's incomprehensible, and it's not clear why do I need this mediating link. It requires some familiar actions of him, the kid, actions that do not come from the organic need itself to eat, and they don't come from the object for the porridge that needs to be eaten, but rather come from the spoon itself, from the designated purpose of this spoon. And I would say they would also come from, from the normativity of the social practice for making these kids, training these kids to bodily behave in a way that is understandable to others. So the idea, well, the main message here is that tools continue being tools for us, not because we use them and then they stop being using them and they stop being tools, but because we routinely use them intelligibly in context of use that are shared with others, and we routinely train others to do. So the toolness of these tools is relative to the social practices in which we train people to use them. And these social practices in turn impose a normativity that should be very clear by now, and is that you have to use tools in a way that is understandable to others. Okay. So that's for the first component of the context of use of tools. As for the second one, the constitution of a tool. So the objects, the material objects that we routinely use and that we go through these training, etc. processes are usually highly specialized. They're designed through a lot of time, and they have materials and shapes that result from decades or maybe centuries of design, and from very complicated fabrication processes. And this is the case for pretty much everything that we use in our ordinary life, like a spoon, for example. And according to Simondon, these kind of objects result from concretization processes. So for Simondon, concretization results in technical objects. It's not precisely every object that I'm discussing here. And these technical objects, well, they do have a highly specialized function, and they have at least two characteristics. The first one is that they have internal consistency, and it means that every part that makes up this object is dedicated to to function, to the main function of the object, and when taken out of the object, is not functional anymore. So they're useless if not part of the object. So in the way that Simondon puts it is that parts of structures are overdetermined by the object's functioning, and the whole would be less functional if this part would not be there, if it's taken out. And another characteristic of technical objects, the second one, is that they have an associated milieu. They interact with environmental features around them, and they transform them in something. For example, a motor that transforms oil or wind or water into energy. So the process of concretization is as follows. It starts with an abstract object. An abstract object refers to something that is made in an artisanal way, that is made with parts that are not made explicitly for this, and they have functions outside of the object. And they're handmade. There is not much scientific knowledge involved in this production. And then a concretization process starts in which, through scientific knowledge, these parts are refined, or maybe they disappear and fusion with others, and they are refined and do so to contribute only to the function of the object and to optimize this function. So in this process, you can reach a concrete object that has an integrated system, as I just told you, in which every part function, the only function that they have ideally, is to contribute to the whole function of the object. And the example that he discusses at length, like many pages of motor discussion, is the idea of the motor. So you can start with an abstract motor in which you can see in the image the parts that are used, like these wooden tables and the cables and like the little metal parts, are things that one can buy, like whatever one can find in its own house. So these are parts that are not made for the object, and it's handmade. It's something that you can make in your own house, and it's not precisely the most efficient object that one can have, the most efficient motor that one can have. But through concretization processes, I'm not saying that is literally this is the first motor, but it is the idea. You can reach an object in which every single part is highly designed for making the motor function as a motor. And this is a Formula 1 motor, and this is a piston whose only function is to be part of this motor. It cannot do anything else, unlike these wooden pieces that can be very versatile. And that would be a concrete motor. Okay. The technical object, what I'm saying so far, is an idealized way of understanding concrete objects. Because in real life, the technical object is never completely finished, and it's always open to be improved or to be modified, depending on whatever is needed. And this is according to Simondon. But I would say, contra Simondon, that something very similar happens with tools that start being abstract tools and they become concrete tools, although they don't have an associated milieu. The spoon doesn't interact with, I don't know, air, wind, or whatever to convert into something else. But they do go through this process or becoming a more integrated object in which every part its only function is to complete the whole function. So the internal consistency is augmented through this process and through scientific knowledge. And the tools that we routinely use result from this concretization process, because we live in a world in which pretty much everything that we use is being designed to be massively produced, to be distributed, to be sold, and to be easily used by many people and in highly different contexts. And this process aims to be efficient, aims to use parts that are not redundant, and aim to make objects that are more integrated and more concretized than just artisanal objects like this spoon. Okay. So finally, well, these concrete tools embody also a source of normativity, because the processes of concretization, these of course are collective processes. It's not just one person going from an artisanal spoon to another spoon, but it's collective. So they embody a source of normativity because it transforms raw materials into an object that should be used in a particular way. So the resulting object does not only have constraints of what you can do with the object, but it has constraints of how it should be used. It's designed to be used in a certain way. The spoon is designed to be used for eating, for example, and the motor, the Formula One motor, to be used in a Formula One car. So through this process, one not only achieves a concrete object, but an object that imposes certain normativity in the users. Okay, and the third ingredient, the third process that constitute this context of use, that constitute tools as tools, is the maintenance of a tool, in which other social practices and other concretization processes come together to maintain the tool, and they entangle together to maintain the tool. Okay. So tools are precarious. I mean, objects don't last forever. They break. They need to be repaired. They need to be maintained. They need to be taken care of. Although the precariousness of tools is, of course, not the same in the same time scale as the agent. Tools can break before the agents or outlast us for thousands of years. And this not only happens with the individual tool, but also with the complete behavior setting, the context in which they are useful. So the whole thing, the whole context needs to be maintained. The dependency of humans on things, like we depend on spoons, for example, has been recognized since long, like since the last part of the 20th century, by sociology and anthropology, since Latour mainly. And well, it's been recognized that we depend on other humans and on other things. But then Hodder recently, an British archaeologist, has argued that for understanding human form of life, we also need to understand that things depend also on humans to exist, and things depend on other things to continue existing. And these dependencies, not only on humans on things, but on things on humans and things on other things, can become messy and can become like going in many directions. That's why one of the reasons why he called these entanglements. So the dependencies, as he understands them, are both enabling and constraining. So they're constraining, for example, the dependency of humans on things, and this is not an example that Hodder gives, but Marta and Xavi give. So humans depend on things as can be a constraining, can have a constraining effect, in the sense that they may impose asymmetrical demands on the agent. For example, cell phones have introduced a demand of being constantly available, and this has become a problem for many people in work contexts, that now we're having laws for that in different countries. And this very thing, the smartphone, may also diminish people's agency, which of course is constraining. But on the other hand, the dependency of things on humans also impose demands for humans. Impose the constraint of they need to be repaired, they need to be fixed, and they need to be improved. So for example, for having cell phones to be taken care of, maintained, we need a lot of things. We need a constant influx of energy so we can charge them. We need lines for energy to be transported. We need antennas for the cell phone to be used. We need the raw materials like lithium. This is lithium for the batteries. We know these extractive practices of minerals that are happening all over the world. We need cheap labor, a lot of labor to produce the cell phone. We also need storages of information to keep all the information that we share and that we can access to. So we need these materials being maintained as well. So maintaining a tool requires an entanglement of many other things, many other practices and many other materials and many other work that can become quite messy and can become entangled, according to Hodder. And, well, for Hodder, it will be very difficult to go back, to give back, for example, to give up, for example, the smartphones and big data, because there is already too much invested on them, as we just saw. There is too much at stake, and these things seem to have taken over our form of life. We need the smartphones, we depend on them, even if they lead us to further towards greater global inequalities and global warming in these relationships, in this need to be maintained. So these entanglements are very hard to undo, and we usually as human beings tend to turn to technological solutions rather than to untangle the entanglement to solve whatever problem this is bringing us. One can think, for example, of clean energies that are not yet another technology on top of this entanglement that may have unforeseen consequences, for example, from going to coal, from solar energy may bring the need to have other minerals, and these could have other devastating effects in certain parts of the world. So there are many entanglements that arise from these technological solutions that we cannot foresee all the time. Yeah, and that's why it's very hard to undo entanglements, and that's why it's very hard to predict what's going to happen with the solutions that we invent with our technology. So with these entanglements and with with the need for them to be maintained, I would add to this explanation that Hodder does, that they are so demanding to us because they allow us to maintain our form of life, and they allow us to maintain the interaction with others that we saw in the first part of the talk, that is substantial to belong to a social practice and to belong with others and to be part of a society as a human being. So, in short, the point here is that artifacts or tools in general belong to these entanglements, and the very possibility for their existence to be continued or to be produced in the first place depends on belonging to being a design object and the result of these large-scale entanglements in production, in which you have the available of materials that would be impossible otherwise. And they also smaller entanglements. They're in a setting with in a relationship in which they can be used. So in these two senses, in the sense that for the fabrication and for the repairment and maintenance of an object, you need them to be entangled in production, and because you need them to be also entangled in a setting in which they can be useful, the toolness of tools depends on entanglements. Okay, so to finish, I just showed you that the context of use that make a tool of an object a tool is comprised by three elements: by social practices in which the skills are reproduced, by concretization processes in which objects, not only technical objects but also tools, are being designed and produced, and entanglements in which many other social practices and concretization processes come together to maintain the tool and to maintain the general form of life in which the tool is useful. This also implied that there are certain normativities imposed in the collectively and individually that follow from these elements. The first one is that, of course, social practices impose a normativity on individuals in the sense that the way they use tools needs to be intelligible, needs to be understandable. The concretization of tools also impose normativities that are embodied in the object itself on how it should be used and how it is designed to be used. And finally, the entanglements and the maintenance of tools impose the normative demand for us as humanity to maintain our form, the things that allow us to have the form of life that we have. And that's it. Thank you.